Good evening. I'm Lori Rose, President of the League of Women Voters of the Lake Forest, Lake Bluff area, and I'm excited to welcome you to our fall kickoff series on exploring the healing power of nature. If you're thinking about the connection between nature and politics or voting, you might be thinking about climate change or vaccine mandates. In fact, this centuries-old connection dates back to the 4th century, the time of Aristotle's Politics. The political process assumes that we will continue to inhabit our natural environment and that political structures will assist us in determining how we coexist in that environment. The natural world has provided us with food, supplies, and medicine since the dawn of time. But what happens when we are out of sync with nature and natural rhythms? Jet lag, which can be viewed as an alteration of a natural circadian rhythm, is an example of how we may exist in nature without natural rhythm. Japanese researchers studying the impact of Shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing, have addressed our relationship to nature as one of passive comfort or active comfort. Passive comfort implies that our basic human needs are addressed. For example, we're not too cold and we have sufficient food. Active comfort has an added dimension. Our active comfort stimulates our 5 senses, provides something extra, and relates to our sense of well-being. Our bodies have adapted over millions of years to synchronize with the natural environment. If you think about receiving the gift of a book versus the receiving of a gift of a floral bouquet, you can start to see the distinction between active and passive comfort. The science behind the healing power of nature is compelling. Japanese researchers have established that smelling or touching pine, oak, or cypress wood results in a calming of prefrontal brain activity and a reduction in parasympathetic nerve activity. That translates to a reduction in stress. Other experiments have looked at the benefit of walking in a park, viewing and smelling roses, and the impact of nature upon stress markers in saliva and immune activity. Our league voted to adopt an action focus on healthcare mental health during an international health crisis, which created crowded hospitals, exhausted healthcare workers, and rising costs of care. As part of our action focus, we created a series of educational, interactive programs which contain self-care and community resources that can be utilized by members and others. We hope that these programs will facilitate wellness within our community. Tonight, we are very fortunate to be joined by 2 guest speakers affiliated with Northwestern Lake Forest Hospital, League member and Northwestern Memorial Foundation Program Director of Philanthropy, Marlena Cross, who worked very hard to facilitate this program, and Dr. Martha Twaddle, a national leader in palliative medicine and supportive care. They will expand upon the way that the natural world impacts well-being and share a resource for practice within our community. We are very grateful for the gifts of their time and their expertise. Katie Anderson, our Vice President of Program Action and Advocacy, will introduce our speakers soon and explain the structure of this evening's program. Katie spent many hours, including during her family vacation in the desert, working on our fall kickoff events, and we are very grateful for her efforts. I'll return at the end of the hour with some closing remarks. And now, without further ado, Katie Anderson.
Thank you, Lori. Our first speaker, Dr. Martha Twaddle, is the Wad Family Medical Director of Northwestern Medicine at Lake Forest Hospital, Palliative Medicine and Supportive Care. She is also a clinical professor of medicine at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. Dr. Twaddle is a national leader in palliative medicine and supportive care with over 30 years of experience in the field. She leads the advancement of the mission of palliative medicine and supportive care, that every person, along with their family and caregivers, when confronted with a serious illness, will receive ongoing, comprehensive supportive care tailored to their needs and delivered by an interdisciplinary team to achieve the best possible care and outcomes. Dr. Twaddle received her medical degree from Indiana University School of Medicine and completed a residency at McGaw Medical Center at Northwestern University. In 2000, Dr. Twaddle made the decision to dedicate her career to palliative medicine and worked to ensure it became a full medical specialty by 2006. Prior to returning to Northwestern, Dr. Twaddle worked for Rush University, where she helped develop palliative medicine fellowship program. Having joined Lake Forest Hospital in 2017, Dr. Twaddle is poised to set the national standard for palliative medicine and supportive care. Dr. Twaddle lives and her husband live on a farm in Mettawa and have 2 grown children. She shares her time and expertise in many ways in the community and serves on the board of the Brushwood Center at Ryerson Woods. After her presentation, we'll have some questions, question and answer period, and then we'll hear from Marlena Cross, who is one of our league members. And professionally, she is the program director of philanthropy at the Northwestern Memorial Foundation at Northwestern Medicine Lake Forest Hospital. She joined the Memorial Foundation in 2010, and having served on a variety of roles in the central office at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, including major gift officer for the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences for several years. And she worked closely with the department chair, Dr. John Chernansky. And she and her husband, Nick, have 5 daughters and live in Lake Forest and have a great appreciation for the nature and gifts of open land, green space, and walking trails in our community. Marlena is going to present information on the walkways at Northwestern Lake Forest Hospital campus and how nature plays an important role in the walking and biking experience. And now, Dr. Twaddle, let you have the
so much. Well, I am going to share my screen, and it's such a tremendous pleasure to be with you all this evening. Hold on one second. Let's get this launched. Thank you for the very, very warm welcome. And this is an area of medicine and care and community support that I feel very passionate about, as you will see as I go through these slides. You know, it's interesting that you would want someone who's in palliative medicine feels so passionate about wellness, because wellness doesn't mean that you're free of disease. Wellness is being able to live well despite sometimes various serious illness and infirmities and debilities and disabilities. And wellness is really what I'm about. Certainly for the most vulnerable folks who are diagnosed with serious illness, I found my true calling and passion in medical care. But wellness extends to them and to families and those who care for them. So we're going to talk about some of the issues that exist because of our, quote, built environment. I think that this group in particular is mindful of this, waking up to recognize the impact of where we live and how it affects our brains, our immune system, our endocrine system, and certainly our psyche. And I'm going to use in particular the example of diabetes, because this is where we're doing some active research, and it's a great model to demonstrate in very measurable ways how it plays a role in achieving better health and how important it is to look at this for our community. Now, I talk about public health and population health is really intimately related, because population health is how we as healthcare professionals look at groups of people and risk stratify within different populations who might be at risk or who might share similar diagnoses, with the goal of improving access, standardizing access, looking at health disparities, and reducing mortality and morbidity for that population, and finding different ways to identify populations increasingly, interestingly, through health informatics is a growing way to identify people who might be served. The other piece about population health is that it certainly helps research agendas as we identify groups that are at risk. And I use this little diagram that myself and Brad Buxton drew back in 2011. I can't believe it's already been that long ago. Really like this little, show us what I'm talking about with population health. So thinking about, let's say, the population, the general population served by a system of Northwestern's North region, would include the well on the right, and then people with chronic illnesses, diagnoses, and the population that I focus on most, which would be the far left, which would be folks with serious illness where they have functional impairment, progressive illnesses, and much more pressure on themselves and the people who love and care for them. The reality is that none of these people exist in isolation, that the folks who receive palliative care are loved and cared for by those who might be well or who also might be ill. And so as we think about how to care for a population of folks, recognize that the impact of one experience affects the whole. And how do we improve access? How do we support them? Just a little bit of levity. And saying something's just, our air is clean, our water's pure, we all get plenty of exercise, everything we eat is organic and free range, and yet nobody lives past 30. So there is some advantage to modern healthcare in terms of what we have advanced. And I am often amazed when I look back at my 30+ year career and think of the advances in cardiac care, in oncology care, and in field therapy. It's amazing. The ability to diagnose and to treat has come a long, long way. And when the New England Journal of Medicine celebrated its 200th anniversary, they're very optimistic about healthcare in our country. Also, one of the things even identified in 2012, well, in 1912, and certainly in 2012, is a horrific epidemic particularly in Western civilizations, of obesity. And the implication of obesity epidemic, which is subtle and pervasive, and what that means to the advances that we have made in healthcare. Now, this slide, it goes up to 2017, data collection and big international presentations often lag by 2 to 3 years to obtain some of the data. This one's going to change dramatically because of COVID. It used to be that communicative diseases, viruses, infectious diseases were not so huge, and we're going to see that red section probably take a bigger percentage of the whole. But the vast majority of people in the world are affected by vascular disease more than anything, non-infectious diseases. We've come a long way with public health measures and with antimicrobials to change the face of illness. But in the United States in particular, the predominant cardiovascular disease of heart failure is the #1 cause of death, and actually of morbidity leading up to death. And with that, expenses. So what we see a lot of Western medicine in countries in the United States is something called the metabolic syndrome. And you might have heard of this. It's a tragic condition of abdominal obesity, truncal obesity, associated then with a insulin resistance, that the insulin does not function well in the body and the critical glucose is not getting into the cells. It's actually elevated in circulation, typically associated with hypertension and hyperlipidemia, which would be high cholesterol, high fats in the blood. And these are the folks who go on then heart events, heart attacks, heart failure, as well as other conditions, kidney problems, and many, many times combined with metabolic syndrome is over diabetes. There is a direct correlation to the development of the metabolic syndrome with the consumption of high calorie, low fiber foods, of fast foods, of highly processed. And there's a high correlation, of course, with the consumption of those foods, and then poor activity levels, lack of exercise, leading to the metabolic syndrome. And this, believe me, it drives a huge percentage of our healthcare costs, is caring for folks who have metabolic syndrome and have really acquired this because of lack of exercise and poor nutrition. And some of that has to do with things under their control, but a lot of it has to do with the built environment around them. The lower socioeconomic communities who might not have as much choice as to where they live and how they live. We know that there's a 50 difference in terms of life expectancy between Lake Forest and North Chicago. And this isn't because of the environment, other than the fact that folks may not have access to fresh fruit and vegetables to be able to afford them. The built environment in its extreme, I mean, this picture makes my blood pressure go up in a city in Asia with me. But even in our own country, in urban areas where people may have to live or may choose to live, the noise, the excessive, just the constant stimulation has an adverse effect on us. And this little slide I keep near me because it's me that we create our environment, sometimes not just because it's the built environment, but what we surround ourselves with. And there's a lot of ambient noise that is very, very distressing and stressful to our systems, as well as light. We don't sometimes to turn off or get away from, or we choose or forget that continuing those light sources late into our circadian rhythm can adversely affect our sleep and therefore adversely affect our health. It seems like we don't take it to that conclusion sometimes. We think of it just in terms of it's a nuisance, but it actually is a health risk. Americans spend almost 11 hours a day on electronic media associated or stimulated by it, and lots of light and noise. And this is also what it is that we're listening to, how it comes at us. It's bad enough that it might be stimulating, keeping us awake, causing our brains to try to process it, but it's also the anxiety level that it provokes. And I think all of us have gone through this for the last years between the January 6th and ongoing COVID. It's very, very difficult to listen to this constant sense of enraged and the sky is falling, and that exists in our society, which I have never seen, and I wish that my mom and dad were alive to talk to them about this, because it's interesting to have their perspective on this. Even when we seek to pull away, there is a lot that lingers, and really society suffer from overstimulation. Some of it seeming that it's good, but too much. So what happens when we are receiving all this stimulation, this light, this noise, this vibration? It affects our brains, and then it affects the rest of us. Our brain, the deepest part of our brain is what's the brain stem. It's considered the most primitive part of our brain. And it's where our protective impulses lie. So this part of our brain is how we survive. And when under threat, it activates with what is fight, flight, or freeze. And it goes deep into the midbrain and generates reflexive actions, and then the release of certain neurochemicals, neural hormones to stimulate a response. Now that's great if you're out and there's a tiger, so fight, flight, or freeze. You got to do something. You don't need, it's not even getting to your cortex. It's hitting your deep brain. It's generating a reflex so that you can survive. The problem is that the threats don't go away. They're not tigers, or they're tigers that just sit there. The threats become part of the world that we live in. And some of them we can turn off, but some of them we cannot. Societal structures or community issues that lead to this constant sense of threat. And there's no getting away from that. And that affects our. So I don't know if any of you have tried to diet at all or lose weight during this pandemic, but I would tell you it will probably be impossible because your body is under stress, because your brain is under stress, and there is a threat that continues to be around you, as well as talked about a lot in the news, and leads to the release of certain neurochemicals. Not only is there the tendency to eat a lot, but there's also neurochemicals and inflammation. You only have to walk through Target and realize how much there is out there to soothe and to try to or alleviate. Watch the news and watch the commercials about different modalities of finding relief. Sometimes that medicinal relief comes in different packages. Some of it is food. There is actual science to why crispy, sour things get right into our brain, why they have an addictive component to, they make us feel better, unfortunately, with a great price tag in terms of weight gain. There's other things that we can get somewhat addicted to, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok videos, online shopping. I love this. This is so cute. It keeps you from looking at my phone every 2 seconds and putting a little thing around our head so we can't look down at our phone. And we do, when we're stressed, trying to cope with that is to look for solutions and to be very vigilant. Some of these things stem from that vigilant. So, and our deep brain, our brain stem is our central organ in perceiving stress and threat and helping us to move away from it and survive. So in the immediate, with the immediate threat, with a threat that's short-lived, that's adaptive, that's a good thing. Problem is when the threat doesn't go away, action of our brain and then our body becomes maladaptive. And one of the principal things that happens are the steroids, the cortisol, the stress hormones that begin to be released in our system, driven by our brain and affecting all of our body functions, as well as causing inflammation and causing immune responses that are not effective. So this affects everything. In the short term effective, in the long term maladaptive, and can actually continued stress can actually begin to change our genetic material, causing chromosomal breakage, mutations, such, and may lead, of course, to cancers, certainly other types of neuroendocrine issues. Inflammation is thought to be the root cause of many of the conditions with which we seek medical care. Heart disease has an inflammatory basis. Depression has an inflammatory basis. Renal disease and of cancer, of course. And the symptom load, the symptom burden of cancer is primarily inflammatory in nature. If we can get rid of the inflammation, either by treating the cancer or using very strong anti-inflammatories, the person can feel a lot better. And of course, we try other things such as opioids, cannabinoids, such like that to modify the inflammatory effects of stress and of disease. So our nervous system is impacted, and that leads to high blood pressure, our endocrine system under stress, more cortisol, that leads to diabetes, particularly type 2 diabetes. And the immune system, chronic inflammation, which leads to a whole host of diseases, including, of course, inflammatory arthritises and rheumatoid arthritis and such like that. But certainly, I don't think a lot of us realize that cardiovascular disease is at its roots inflammatory, what's happening in our blood vessels. So doing a little bit of a deep dive diabetes, because diabetes is treatable, preventable, we can modify it with lifestyle changes caught early enough. And the built environment in and of itself drives the development of type 2 diabetes through all sorts of different ways, through the diet, through the sleep wake, through the exposure too much noise and light, etc. And as we grow these, the built environment, we see the diabetes risk, even in societies where diabetes was not that prevalent, start to take off and grow because of the very same issues. The built environment is directly related to metabolic syndrome and directly related to diabetes. It's bad enough to have that illness, which of course is like fertilizer, heart disease, fertilizer for dementia and stroke, but it's an incredible expense. $327 billion in indirect and 245 billion in direct, and that doesn't count all the cost effects for people in terms of missed days, complications, more infections, debility related to neuropathies that develop, infections in their lower extremities, all sorts of things. So diabetes have medical expenditures about 2.3 times more than other folks who do not have diabetes. So trying to manage by cure diabetes would be a profoundly beneficial intervention for our communities, and looking at ways where we can address this early in childhood, because that's where it takes root, and even for adults, because we spend so much money in the US, both in direct and indirect costs because of diabetes. So I painted a bleary and so here. So let's take a walk. We need a remedy. And what I find interesting is, you know, the research in the effect of nature on well-being and on health is, we are working on different funding opportunities, and we've been working on, believe it or not, an NIH grant. We keep getting nice feedback, but we haven't gotten funded yet, and I think we're on round 3. Certainly approaching a drug company, particularly one that creates pharmaceuticals for diabetes, they're not interested in funding us, just as a reflection of where the money is about treating this disease versus curing this disease. So this beautiful example, this is so elegant in its simplicity, is that walking in reduces fasting blood sugar. And I want to show you some of the examples. I had the privilege of working with Terry Horton, who's a PhD anthropologist at North. She's my research person who devises these and creates these studies, does all the hard work of applying for grants. And we are now working with the University of Minnesota to try to achieve this NIH grant, which actually first NIH grant for Northwestern Lake Forest if we're able to secure it. So what this little study is let's examine what is the impact of the physical environment on the chronic stress levels, as well as with using blood glucose as our example, as our measure. Let's see what the physical environment does to blood glucose. So the way this is called a crossover trial. So it means Faye is going to take a walk on the sidewalk for 3 days, and then they're going to take a walk in the park, in the forest preserve for 3 days. And then, well, it's actually for a week at a time. So this is a 6-week study. And group B is going to start in the forest preserve, and then the same group is going to cross over and walk in the more built environment, in the urban environment. And where this study was done, this is where my original practice was. That's not why it was done there. But I used to have my practice at Old Orchard in Skokie in the middle of the mall, which is quite fun. So this study, one group was walking for 50 minutes along Old Road and the mall, kind of, you know, crossing over 94 there, kind of in that area. And the other group was walking in the woods right there by Skokie Lagoon. Well, it's not actually Skokie Lagoon, it's the forest right there by Old Orchard. And the two groups switched. And so what we looked at is what was the effect of fasting glucose. And now one of the things I have to remind us is these were not diabetics. These were healthy volunteers. But even in people healthy lifestyles, they're not overweight. These folks were not overweight. None of them had diabetes. Even those who were healthy showed a drop in blood glucose walking in the forest versus walking in the built environment. So you can see that before they're pretty matched, but then when they walk in the built environment, their blood sugar is not as low. So their cortisol levels are probably high. The forest walks reduce their fasting blood sugar, and it was statistically significant. It also had a much better effect on their sense of well-being. It had a better effect on their anxiety, and that lasted, or their perceived stress. In fact, perceived stress was not affected at all. They stayed the same when they walked in the built environment, but walking in the woods, their sense of perceived stress dropped significantly. Just remarkable. And this was 50 minutes, 3 times a week for this group. So we know that contact with nature, so it's not just physical activity. Both these groups were walking. They were both walking the same amount, 50 minutes, 3 times a week. That's part of it. So their blood sugar would be lower probably than people who didn't walk at all. So physical activity is part of it, but there's more to it than that. Lori, you did such a gorgeous job of saying that the Japanese word about forest bathing. I just stumble over it every single time. I keep practicing. I love the Nature Fix by I can't think of her name, Frances, who wrote that book, where she discusses a lot of the science behind this. Not only does this time in nature help our physical, our heart, cardiovascular, but it restores our ability to concentrate. And it lowers our perceived stress, lowers our cortisol, but it also has effect on us as community, is one of the other things that has been measured. I'm not going to present that data here, but more time in nature and places that have more green space or parks, et cetera, leads to better social interactions, more sense of connection, and actually less violence. And that study, the study that was done years ago at Cabrini Green, that groups of neighbors who looked out on trees had substantially less violence in the home and between homes than the group that didn't have access to green. It's absolutely fascinating. And that's been repeated in Detroit, et cetera. So there are benefits to us physically in terms of our health, and there are tremendous benefits to us as far as our community. So as I mentioned, we're continuing to doggedly pursue this NIH grant. We really want to see an ability to do this study on a larger scale to look at the impact of prescriptive nature on diabetes, looking at both, mostly we want to be diabetics. So people who have been diagnosed with early diabetes and seeing if we can avoid them ever having to be on medication. Can you imagine what would do? That would be. So, speaking to such a wonderful group this evening, what I see us doing together, what this is always all about is we are creating community health systems. All of us have a role in promoting the health and well-being of our community. And through the simplest of things, and certainly even parks and safe places to walk and better lighting and grocery stores and community gardens and things like that, not only help us feel good, but they make a difference for our community and the health of our community and the healthcare costs of our community over the long haul. It's a wonderful thing to be a part of, is really growing and investing in the health of our communities. And obviously part of that is looking at we're not looking at equality, we're looking at creating health equity, but more than that, removing the barriers that allow people to even access. And like I said, there's a 15-year and mortality, life expectancy between 2 neighborhoods that practically bump up against each other. And that has to do with access to safe spaces and to better food and to better education and public health. And the United States, sadly, is of all developed countries, spends the smallest amount of money per healthcare dollar on public health. We spend less than 30 cents on the dollar, whereas most developed countries spend more than 70 cents on the dollar for public health intervention. So something to be thinking about as a group, as an individual. How do we support health through modifying the built environment? What are some of the things that we can do to help? How do we improve access to nature, to green space, to allowing people safe places to really interact? How do we message this and influence a healthcare industry that's really about treating diseases and making money off of pharmaceuticals? And how do we, the greater good, really about, let's invest in health, not disease. So both, but let's really invest in health. And then how do we better create and energize consumer awareness and demand? So thank you. Let me open this up for questions. And then of course, also my colleague Marlena to hear what she has to say. Really appreciate this time.
Do we have any questions? We have a small enough group, so I think you could, if you have a question, unmute yourself and just kind of shout it out, if that's okay for Dr. Twaddle.
It's sure okay.
Hey, Martha, this is Wiebke. I guess I just want to remark that I'm out and about walking a lot, and sometimes it strikes me as very funny and strange when, I don't know, what did I have yesterday? I saw a couple jogging together, and they were both had their ear pods in and were listening to something, but they were running with each other. And I'm like, okay, that's strange. Or I sometimes, when I walk the dog, find myself checking my phone too. So I think for me, a lot of the benefit of being out in nature, and I would argue that that might even be measurable to some extent, especially if you look at cardiac parameters during the walk, is really the ability and the mindset and the willingness of being surrounded by nature and immersing yourself in nature. And I would argue that if you have your phone and you're checking your emails while walking through a forest, you can still be anxious, and the forest will not be able to counteract that.
That's 100% true.
So for me, a lot of impact, I think, is not just that maybe historically we spend fewer minutes in nature than maybe, I don't know, we did 100 years ago, but I think a large part for me is really that impact of social media and the mindset, how we feel we always have to be accessible and we always have to respond and we always have to be on. That and I kind of wonder too, I'm a researcher myself, there are obviously a lot of confounding factors you would be looking at in your research, and I do feel that the social media part is a pretty large factor in really mental health, and I would argue also physical health too.
Oh, I think so too. I think it induces tremendous stress and vulnerability. And you're absolutely right. If we take the built environment with us, or we carry ourselves in a little bubble of stimulation, asking us to do the same thing and react the same way, then we're missing the point of being in the natural space. And it's really interesting. There's studies looking at attention memory, the ability to create memory, recall, and about 45 minutes in front of a flat screen computer or a TV, but particularly a computer, our ability to recall and really have memory of what we're doing starts to drop off. We're not synthesizing. And so, and also our blood pressure does stop. This naturally starts to go up as we sit in front of this one-dimensional screen. So what they found is going outside and even 15 minutes, 20 minutes starts to come down, and we start to synthesize what it is that we actually were reading about. It's when we're not engaged. And think of that. I'm sure we've all had this experience, right? Like we're going for a walk or we're gardening and all of a sudden we go, oh. And I realized, my husband taught phys ed for 33 years, and he would tell me that it has a lot to do with physical activity, but it has a lot more to do about socialization, because he was in junior high. And I also realized that what happens is when we sit there in a classroom and we're exposed to information, where we actually integrate the information is when we're engaged in physical activity out on the playground or in a sport. That's when we start putting stuff together, even in our subconscious mind. If we don't give ourselves the space to do that, because we're listening to a podcast or a radio, it's not going to help. You're 100% correct. You've got to have an ability to be quiet and experience the different sounds and smells and textures of the natural world in order to integrate information and allow your brain to kind of reset. If you don't do that, it doesn't.
I have a question for you, Dr. Twaddle. What about, so what you've just said, how do we get that to be the message that's part of the primary care physician checklist? I mean, I would say asking mental health questions in a routine physical is something that's of the last few years, that is a routine part of it. But how about everything you've just said? How does that get, how do we make that happen?
Yeah. So obviously through education and implementing different types of support. So one of the things is prescriptive nature. So there's a little app on the phone called Park RX. So imagine you went to see your physician and your blood was a little bit off, or your weight was a little bit off, or let's say your fasting glucose is running a wee bit high. And they said, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to prescribe for you time in the park. If, part of our study is to introduce this app and this way of teaching physicians to teach their patients a different way of, isn't just a pill, that isn't just a diet. It's about taking care of themselves in nature. And this app identifies places where they can walk, places that they can find very easily that would be safe and well lit and accessible for them. That's something that we're going to have to work on as a society, because not everybody has access to safe places to walk and where they would feel safe. But that's actually what to do, is turn this tide such that physicians are equipped not just to reach for their prescription pad for a pill, to prescribe park activity or green space activity, to know enough about this to use it as a modality. And it would start in pediatrics. It needs to start in pediatrics. Kids need to find this. One of the things I often revel in is, because of my husband's expertise, when our kids would get stressed and kind of goofy, he'd have them go run around the house for every year of their life. Well, what was really funny is after a while, they just started doing it on their own. They're like, I got to go run around the house. And what it reinforced for them is that physical activity or being outside helped them cope with stress. And to this day, they're both in their 20s. That's what they do. So it has to start when they're young. They have to learn that the adaptation makes them feel better, makes them feel good about themselves, and decrease stress. It's fun watching them run around the house.
Anybody else?
I was a middle school teacher, and we had the students do the same thing.
Yeah.
We'd have them go run around the building their age. It was
They
cool.
have to get it out, right? It's spilkies. Yeah, Ian.
Quick question. I play tennis outdoors in the summertime. So I'd like to know, I'm not walking through the woods and looking at the trees. I'm thinking about the tennis ball and what I'm going to do next. How does that compare in stress value to walking through the woods?
Well, it probably, so the physical activity, and that's a fairly robust physical, right? And the fact that you're outside and between serves and between running, you likely are conscious of the beauty of where you are, the smells, the feel of the air, the light, etc. Those aspects are part of what our brain needs. They use the term fractals, is that it's all the environment isn't uniform the same. It's not flat, it's multidimensional. And our brain needs that to help it regroup. So because you're playing outside, there's that benefit. It probably would not, you'd still have that wonderful physical activity, which will be very good for your heart and very good for your blood pressure. You add to it, just people who walked, you add to it by doing it outside.
Okay. I have one more comment. We just had an art fair in Market Square, and Northwestern Medicine supplied us with first aid. I want to thank you.
Oh, that's great. That's great. You know, it's funny. I'll digress to say they don't want me there. One time one of my friends was in the ED, and I went and sat with her, and one of the surgeons looked at me in horror and said, "Oh, Martha, she's not that sick." So I have a very weird association with very illness. So they don't want me doing first aid because it might.
Well, this has been really terrific, Dr. Twaddle. I personally am very inspired by both your research and your suggestions. I think you've given us so much to think about. In particular, you know, our league and all the local leagues are very grassroots, very bottom up. And one of the things we do is we go to town meetings and we track things that are happening on the legislative and the local level. And we have organizations such as the Building Review Board. We have in Lake Forest the Zoning Board. We have the Historic Preservation Group, and we're creating built environment on a daily level. And I think I personally sit on the Zoning Board, and I'm always surprised how little attention is getting paid to. Do we have permeable pavers? And you know, people say, well, we're going to have a couple trees thrown in, but as we're creating more and more built environment, even in very green areas such as Lake Forest, Lake Bluff, and the surrounding communities, we can all be a little more conscious of those things in terms of the impact in our health. And I think, you know, our program, which is broad, is also action and advocacy. So there's opportunities to advocate at our local level on some of these issues. And on the action side, I'm here to advertise part 2 of this program, which is coming up on Friday. And it's actually, we're going to try to practice what Dr. Twaddle and Marlena Cross are preaching, which is walking in nature. So we're going to Heller Nature Center, which is technically in Highland Park, not in Lake Forest or Lake Bluff, but on the very edge of Lake Forest. And we're going to meet at 11 o'clock in front of the building, which is now closed. We chose Heller for a couple of reasons, but it has easy parking and also nice trails that are not asphalt. And there's a really nice, at this time of year, forest canopy. Vika Drogi and I will be leading the walk. We're not experts, but we have spent many years walking together in various forest environments, and some built environments as well. And we're going to try and take some of these techniques that you've spoken about and we've been reading about, and really also create, to another point that you made very well, the sense of community. So we hope that if you haven't signed up, you can sign up on Zoom. The sign up is just so we know who's coming. We're going to have healthy snacks, which are no sugar, all fruits, no nuts, which might be an allergic component, and we can tell you exactly what's in them if you have some food concerns or sensitivities. Bring your own water, insect repellent, whatever, you know, natural sunscreens. And so we're going to do this, and we hope that this will be the start of an ongoing process for our league. We'd like to do these once a month. one of the things that we found is exactly what you're saying, that there's a sort of a sense of a burnout on Zoom, and Zoom related events, as interesting as they are, people are wanting to have that sense of community. And how can we create that at this moment in the league and also be true to our principles? So it seems like a regular monthly walking activity would serve that purpose. And we're so fortunate in our community, as most people on this Zoom call know, that we have so many different spaces that we could select. Last December, some of us went for a walk in the Botanic Garden. We saw the light exhibit, and we hope to do that again this year. And there's so many opportunities that we could take to really put this into practice. And we're not going to be research subjects, I don't think. But
Well, if you want to be, we'll let you know.
Okay. Well, it would be great to get that research moving along. But I want to encourage everybody, if it's going to be a short walk, 30 to 40 minutes, very easy. We'll go very slowly. So if you haven't signed up, please do. I know not everybody can walk, but we will have more activities in the future. We hope eventually to get to the hospital campus, which you'll hear about momentarily. So I just wanted to invite everybody once again to join us Friday, Heller Nature Center, 11 o'clock, and hope to see you there. So now I'm going to turn it over to Marlena for some more information.
Well, thanks, Lori. I know Katie's got the slides here.
There we go.
Yep. We just wanted to take a minute here to make sure you're all aware of yet another resource in our community. We are blessed with many options and many resources around Lake Forest and Lake Bluff area, but Lake Forest Hospital, you know, has always uniquely been situated in this very park-like setting. The original founders and donors of the land and so on were concerned and had that vision that nature was part of the healing environment. They knew that from the beginning. And so when the new hospital was built just in recent times, you know, they kind of reconfirmed that commitment to keeping the open space, designing kind of a naturally inspired landscape that would be accessible to the community. And last summer, we were so glad, even amidst COVID, to complete the planned network of trails on the campus. And I hope you can see the lines. Some of them are a little hard to see because of the colors chosen on the campus map, but literally the trails connect from Deer Path through the campus, around the hospital pond, or the other way to the west side of the new hospital building, and out to Waukegan Road. And you can go across to Middle Fork and then to the trails that go up and down the open lands over there. So it's part of a greater network of trails, which is even more exciting. There's plenty of parking, and you know, there's water features. The waterfall by the hospital provides some of that sound that you can hear if you don't have your headphones in. I did include this photo over here on the left side. Some of the trails are paved, so they're easy to walk if, you know, people are worried about their footing. And then there's actually trails out on the west side of the campus that are gravel and more natural in setting, so you can really get out there just steps away from the hospital. There are over 600 trees, many of them newly planted across the campus. So in future years, this is really going to be a verdant, beautiful landscape. Do you want to flip to the next slide? Excuse me. Yeah, there's one of those gravel paths out in the west. They kind of wind around the drumlins, so you can get away from the hospital building where you're not viewing it, even as you're walking on campus, and then swing back to it into view. There are some beautiful little natural spots that have I want to say been developed, but they've just, you know, occurred. Nature has done her work, and there's a little group of ducklings there that we captured in the spring by photograph. And then there's some points across the campus, like the Legacy Seal Garden that's in the bottom right here, where you can stop and sit down and observe the plants around you and, you know, feel the sun on your face. And those have been carefully designed at different places across the campus to give the staff who work in our hospital, places of respite, places to get away and out of the hospital building. Places for people to actually get together outside. So there's seating like this where they can hold an outdoor meeting, which I've seen managers do. Anyway, this is really a resource intended for the community. And I will share that we do have a few physicians who are prescribing walks on campus to their patients. And I know there's one primary care physician that sees patients on the hospital campus who regularly takes his own 25-minute walk at noon every day. And it's just, it's inspiring to see him out there because it reminds all of us to do the same. But we wanted to make sure you all are aware of this and certainly invite the league when the time is right to have one of our outdoor walks at Lake Forest Hospital.
I really commend the hospital for doing this because there is such it's very much accessible, safe, ideal for any one of the people who would consider themselves part of our community, our greater community. So I'm super grateful. It's just beautiful.
It is very beautiful, and it's also not, I'm glad you highlighted this, Marlena, because it's not immediately apparent even when you're, entering the hospital, that this whole network of trails exists and it's open to the maybe not now, might be a little restricted time, but typically it's intended to be open to the entire community, not just the hospital community, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's open all the time. There's a trail access from Deer Path Road and from Waukegan Road. This morning I saw a couple riding their bikes around the corner of the hospital, and I've seen families out there with their little ones at the end of the day, one of them on a trike and the parents walking. It's there to be used by everyone, and it's really great to see people discovering it. Mm-hmm. So you're welcome, and make a date with a friend and come over here for a walk.
Yeah, and having the paved allows you to use wheelchairs and walkers, mm-hmm. and not just restricted to folks who can walk.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
My experience, the picture with the ducks, there seems to be a story now every year. Last year it was the 3 sandhill cranes that took up residence and every so often wanted to walk across Waukegan Road. Mm-hmm. So it's fun to see what next year's story is going to be and who's going to take up residence for the season. So
it's really amazing, and it's beautiful to see as the seasons turn, even it changes. So anyway, wanted to make you all aware, and it's just an example of what can be done. And Dr. Twaddle, I hope someday we'll see our outdoor space being part of your laboratory.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
Nature affects our health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and one of the things that very much interests me is my patient population, for all sorts of reasons, has another barrier or other barriers to accessing nature, whether it be physical impairments or it might be immunocompromised state, et cetera. So yet we know that nature might help the symptom burden. So we want to explore how we might bring nature to them. And what interaction might really help them live well with their serious illness. Again, wellness being not just the absence of disease, but how we live despite diagnoses, et cetera.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you to our speakers. Hopefully we'll see many of you, or if not all of you, on Friday. And
Katie, do you want to just say a brief word about the in process October program, which is next in our series of part of dealing with health? All right, we don't have a date certain yet. Yeah. But for October, we're planning something on shifting a little bit more to the mental health sphere about how to have conversations and how to have conversations without having antagonism and how to have peaceful conversations, even when you might have differing points of view, whether they're political, personal, familial, that kind of thing. So we're working on that one, and you know, I just want to bring it back to our one of our action foci for the year is healthcare and mental health, and it's all connected, and tonight we can start to make more of those connections about how the physical health and mental health are so interconnected and part of our natural world. So
Yeah.
thank you, everybody. It's been a great evening, and try to come on Friday if you can.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Good night. Thank
Be
you.
well. Be well.